Today we're going to be reviewing Ray Dalio's A Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. This is the third book in a series of books written by legendary investor Ray Dalio, founder and CEO of Bridgewater and Associates. It's the third book. It was written in 2021, and I know this video review is coming out in 2025, but I wanted to go ahead and make this book review because although I did purchase this book in 2021, I only just now got around to reading it, but I had to read it before I read his newest book, which came out in 2025, and so stay tuned for that book review. But I have reviewed his other two books, Principles and Big Debt Crises. I'll have those book reviews pop up, so if you're interested in kind of seeing the evolution of my interactions with Ray Dalio's books, please check out those videos. Ray Dalio has been one of my main intellectual mentors, although I've never met him, just like through his books in my journey to understand the markets over the last 7 years that I've been trying to be, a student of the markets. And, Ray talks about in interviews that he wrote this book because after 35 years in the markets, he's finally at this place where he wants to give back. And it's interesting because he talks about very early on in this book how he's trying to create a framework. He's not trying to scare anyone or necessarily talk bad about any country. He's trying to be as analytical and descriptive as he can be in trying to describe sort of what are the forces that drive a changing world order and what are those basic building blocks and kind of outline the structure of it. And he uses a historical lens to do that. And in Big Debt Crises, you'll see that Ray Dalio talks about the rise and fall of empires, multiple empires. And in this book, he similarly focuses on the rise and fall of empires, but this time he narrows it down just to 3 empires. So the US, Great Britain, and the Dutch. And he's trying to sort of show you how countries rise and fall and how their currency and debts and sort of the 3 big forces which he talks about, which are internal capital markets, external forces, and internal forces, and how these 3 factors and determinants show the rise and fall of empires. One thing I like about Ray Dalio, though, is that even after building a billion-dollar company and studying the markets for decades, right, he still has tremendous humility. And he demonstrates that on page 17, very early on in his book, when he writes, "I still can't be sure that I'm right about anything. I also know from experience that if I want to learn enough to be satisfied with what I know before acting or sharing, I'd never be able to use or convey what I have learned." And I thought that was really interesting, right? Because, to be able to write this book took Dalio decades of research and understanding and being a student of the markets. And so to think that you're going to be able to read this book and then create a video articulating with the same sort of sophistication and depth that Dalio is able to write is, sort of a fool's errand. And really what I'm trying to do is, 1, document my own intellectual journey, but 2, encourage those people who may be thinking about reading Dalio's book to go ahead and pick it up, because I found it tremendously interesting, insightful, and there's more takeaways in this book that I can actually convey in a video, and I'll never be able to speak as eloquently about these topics as Dalio, but I'm going to do my best to sort of, if you wait until your learnings are perfect, or if you wait until your learnings are without rebuke, then you'll never be able to actually share what you've learned. So Dalio starts the book by talking about the big cycle and the 18 determinants of the big cycle. And he focuses on 3 that he calls the most important determinants. 1, which is the long-term debt cycle / capital markets, the internal order of a country, and the external order. So the internal order being how people interact amongst each other, social institutions, their strength, their infrastructure, relative decay, or, strengthening. And then external order is how those countries interact with other countries, right? And so there are 18 determinants, and I'm not going to go through them all, but Dalio does in depth, but I will list them out outside those other 3. There's also education, innovation, cost competitiveness, military strength, trade, economic output, markets and financial centers, reserve currency status. Some additional determinants are geology, resource allocation, efficiency, acts of nature, infrastructure and investment, character / ability / determination, governance and rule of law, gaps in wealth and opportunity and values. And if you sort of grade these 18 determinants, you can get a relative score. And Dalio talks about how to do that, and he encourages you to do that in the book for yourself. And he also gives his scoring of different countries, and you can kind of see where the countries fall in terms of, growth over the years and sort of where they fall compared to other countries, right? And when trying to trace the big cycle, Dalio traces these determinants over 5 different phases. So you can think about the rise and fall of empire as sort of coming in these 5 different phases, he says, which is, refer to my notes here, the new order, the rise, the top, the decline, and the new order. And on page 85 of the book, Dalio talks about the psychological equivalence of these different stages and sort of how the people within the country are responding and viewing themselves throughout these 5 stages, right? And so those psychological stages are: stage 1, people in their countries are poor and they think of themselves as poor. Stage 2, people in their countries are rich but still think of themselves as poor. Stage 3, people in their countries are rich and think of themselves as rich. Stage 4, people in their countries are poor and still think of themselves as rich. And stage 5, people in their countries are poor and they think of themselves as poor. Now, when I was reading through this book, personally, I felt that America fell into the stage 4, which is people in their countries are poor and still think of themselves as rich. And he talks about some of the characteristics of what this might look like. And I thought this was interesting. Workers in their countries earn and spend a lot. They become expensive. And because they are expensive, they experience slower real income growth rates. Since they are reluctant to constrain their spending in line with their reduced income growth rates, their lower savings rates increases their debts and cut corners. Because their spending continues to be strong, they continue to appear rich, and even though their balance sheets are deteriorating, the reduced level of efficient investment in infrastructure, capital goods, and research and development slows their productivity gains. Their cities and infrastructure become older and less efficient than in the 2 previous stages. It seems that Dalio actually thinks we're in stage 5, not stage 4. So that's one thing I kind of disagreed with him. Regardless, on page 92, Dalio explains how the big cycle plays out. And he says, classically, the big cycle transpires with periods of peace and productivity that increase wealth in a disproportionate way, which leads to a very small percentage of the population gaining and controlling exceptionally large percentage of the wealth and power, then becoming overextended, which leads to encountering bad times that hurt those who are the least wealthy and powerful the hardest, which then leads to conflicts that produce revolutions and or civil wars, which then leads to the creation of a new order in the cycle beginning again. It's interesting that Dalio wrote this book in 2021 because obviously here we are 4 years later and we've kind of got to see some of his predictions not only play out, not in regards to the US and China, which he gets into later in the book, but also just in terms of trying to understand where the United States is within this big cycle, right? As a student of the markets, I've never heard anyone make a distinction between real wealth and financial wealth, but this was another big takeaway for me. Dalio says real wealth is what people buy because they want to have and use it, such as a house, car, streaming video service, etc. Real wealth has intrinsic value. Financial wealth consists of financial assets that are held to A, receive an ongoing income in the future, and or B, be sold in the future to get money to buy real assets people want. Financial wealth has no intrinsic value. As someone who's been learning the markets for themselves, I have always kind of thought as financial wealth as being wealth, right? You think about someone who has a lot of money in the stock market. We've been told that buying the S&P 500 is a way to make money and save for retirement, and I guess sort of the financialization of wealth and pushing money towards the financial economy. It was really interesting to see Dalio sort of distinguish between the real economy and real value and financial economy and financial wealth. And another thing that he said, and I won't be able to find exactly in the book, but he talks about what matters most for countries' growth is inventiveness and innovation. I actually did find it. Inventiveness and innovation in a society is the main driver of productivity. This is on page 90. And then on page 91, he says innovation plus commercial spirit plus a thriving capital markets equals great productivity gains equals increases in wealth and power. When I read that formula gave me some hope and optimism because I do believe that the United States is still the capital of innovation, commercial spirits, and thriving capital markets. Dalio seems to want to argue against that in some respects later on in the book. I'm not going to get too much into that in this video, but I'll allow you to buy the book and read the book. And if you've made it this far in the video review and you're interested in buying the book, I will have the book linked in the description below, so you can buy it using that link on Amazon or whatever the case may be. That helps keep this channel growing. So please use my affiliate link. There were so many takeaways in this book, but my favorite parts of the book were chapter 3 and 4. I found myself reading it very slowly, highlighting a lot, and I'm going to try to do my best again to convey some of some of my main takeaways. I thought on page 109, where he talks about what is money. Obviously, some of the earliest videos I made on this channel were discussions about what is money. And I don't fully agree with Dalio on what money is, but it's interesting because when I made the video on big debt crises, I think that was in like 2018 or 2019, I was talking about how it seemed like Dalio was hinting at Bitcoin in that book. And now in his book in 2021, he actually talks about cryptocurrency specifically. And so it's interesting to kind of think about, was I right whenever he was hinting at what seemed to be digital currencies back then? If you go back and watch that book review, you'll see what I'm talking about. But on page 109, he says, money is a medium of exchange that can also be used as a storehold of wealth. And throughout this chapter, Dalio makes a lot of different distinctions about money versus credit versus wealth, real economy versus the financial economy, the monetary inflation versus real inflation, the price of things versus the value of things. And these were all distinctions that I hadn't really thought about. And so on page 111, Dalio talks about money, credit, and wealth. And he says, while money and credit are associated with wealth, they aren't the same thing as wealth. Because money and credit can buy wealth, i.e. goods and services, the amount of money and credit you have and the amount of wealth you have look pretty much the same. But you cannot create more wealth simply by creating more money and credit. To create more wealth, you have to be more productive. And it seems that this is really prescient, really important to think about right now, because interest rates, the printing of money, and the availability of credit and liquidity is something that's like hotly debated right now in financial markets with the potential resignation of Jerome Powell. And so it's interesting because what Dalio is basically saying is that's not going to create more wealth. The only thing that's going to create more wealth is an increase in productivity. And we've often heard Scott Bessent talking about sort of I think his three stools, but he's often talking about growth as being one of the main drivers of how he thinks America is going to be able to get out of its debt crises that we are clearly in. One of my favorite 2 pages in the book was page 112 and 113. And I have here in the margins written, it is insights like this page are the reason I read Ray Dalio. I think one of the main complaints or disagreements I have with Dalio is his understanding of the economy doesn't quite seem to be an Austrian understanding, right? So he talks about when the level of goods and services demanded is strong and rising and there is not enough capacity to produce the things demanded, the real economy's capacity to grow is limited. If the demand keeps rising faster than the capacity to produce, prices go up and inflation rises. That's where the financial economy comes in. Facing inflation, central banks normally tighten money and credit to slow demand in the real economy. When there is too little demand, they do the opposite by providing money and credit to stimulate the demand. We know that in Austrian economics, the main drivers of prices is not necessarily supply and demand. What's the main driver of prices is human action and human belief, because decisions about what to buy are made on the margin. And, it sort of goes back to the old analogy. If I offer you a bottle of water right now, you'd probably pay $1 for it. But if you just got out of the desert, you'd be willing to pay $100 for it. And I know that sort of the traditional Keynesian economists are going to look at that analogy and say, well, that's because the supply of water is limited in the desert. But what Austrians believe is that it's less about the supply and more essentially about subjective value, right? And the individual's psychology and the individual's action. And so these sections of the book I thought were really interesting. Dalio says, when a lot of currency is created relative to the demand for it, it declines in value. That was really prescient given one of my most recent book reviews, which is Larry Lepard's, I can't remember the name of the book, but essentially what we learn in that book is that 40% of all US dollars created in the world in circulation were created in 2020. So where the money and credit flow is important to determining what happens. For example, when they no longer go into lending, that fuels increases in economic demand and instead go into other currencies and inflation hedge assets, they fail to stimulate economic activity and instead cause the value of the currency to decline and the value of the inflation hedge assets to rise. And I essentially believe that's what we are seeing with Bitcoin and also meme coins in a sense. Going on to page 113. Related to the confusion between the financial economy and the real economy is the relationship between the price of things and the value of things, right? And this gets really to the heart of subjective value theory. And part of the reason why I'm very uncertain, it seems like Dalio is operating in two different economic paradigms, one in which he understands and agrees with Austrian economics, and another in which he is sort of subscribing to traditional Keynesian economics. This is a good analogy. Dalio says, think about it this way. If you own a house and the government creates a lot of money in credit, there might be many eager buyers who would push the price of your house up, but it's still the same house. Your actual wealth hasn't increased. Your calculated wealth. In other words, using the market values of what one owns to measure one's wealth gives an illusion of changes in wealth that don't really exist. This is really interesting when we think about the auto market, right? And sort of what happened as a result of the global financial crisis, or not global financial crisis, but the COVID crisis and the ZIRP policies, zero interest rate policies, where people were able to buy cars at really low rates. And we all kind of remember there was this period in the market where used car values were like increasing, and it like made a lot of sense to essentially sell a car, and it almost made more sense to buy a used car than it did to buy a new car. And when I look at the prices of new cars right now, it seems like you can't get a decent vehicle for something short of $70,000. And I think that that's one of those things where people buy a car, or they buy their second or their third house, and they bought it. And when they measure their own wealth, they're using sort of the value of their homes, their cars, some of these real assets, and they think they're getting wealthier. But the reality is, and we're starting to see this in the housing market as well, it's only worth what someone's willing to buy it for and pay for it. And so if you're measuring your wealth in an asset that's price has gone up over 10 years, it doesn't necessarily mean your wealth has gone up. If you bought another house now, maybe your wealth has gone up, right? Because that's a real asset that people will want to use. And so the car itself is a real asset and has, sort of a value, and is used for productivity and is useful. But the financialization and increases of house and car values itself does not mean you've become more wealthy. So I thought this was really interesting. Short-term debt cycles, Dalio says, typically last about 8 years, give or take. But the long-term debt cycles typically last 50 to 75 years. On page 115, Dalio says, throughout history, central governments and central banks have created money and credit, which weaken their own currencies and raise their levels of monetary inflation to offset the deflation that comes from deflationary credit and economic contractions. This typically happens when debt levels are high, interest rates can't be adequately lowered, and the creation of money and credit increases financial asset prices more than it increases actual economic activity. At such times, those who are holding the debt, which is someone else's promise to give them currency, typically want to exchange the debt they are holding for some other storehold of wealth. I believe this time in 2025, that asset will be Bitcoin. Once it is widely, those were my words. Once it is widely perceived that the money and debt assets are no longer good storeholds of wealth, the long-term debt cycle is at its end, and a restructuring of the money system has to occur. Dalio talks about that oftentimes when these long-term debt cycles are coming to a close, what is happening is that one country is at a decline and another country is at a rising point. And he believes that the United States is at a decline and China is at a rising point, and that throughout history, if you go back and look, sometimes and oftentimes this leads to war. Essentially, what I think is that if China and the U.S. are to go to war, and then we have to create a new monetary system, I think that new monetary system will be based off Bitcoin. And this might be one of the mistakes that China has actually made strategically, and one of the reasons why the United States may be able to continue its global dominance in the financial system is because Bitcoin has been largely accepted by the United States, and Bitcoin has been kind of not as accepted in China, with the banning of mining, cryptocurrency mining and different things. And there was a period in history in which the majority of the world was adopting gold as the gold standard, and China was adopting silver. And it's sort of one of these things where if you're not using the best form of currency and the best money, you pay the price in the long term. So Dalio says that the long-term debt cycle transpires in 6 stages. Stage 1, it begins with little or no debt and money being hard, i.e. things like gold. Then in stage 2, there becomes claims on hard money, things such as notes and paper money. In stage 3, there becomes an increase in debt. In stage 4, the debt crises, defaults, and devaluations come, which leads to the printing of money and the breaking of the link to hard money. So arguably that happened in around 1971 for the United States, in my opinion, whenever the dollar became delinked to gold. And then in stage 5, this is when fiat money, which eventually leads to the debasement of money. So fiat money means money by decree, which is what we live on today. And so then that brings us to stage 6, which is a flight back to hard money, which is where I believe we are currently. On page 124, Dalio says, while people tend to believe that a currency is pretty much a permanent thing and that cash is the safest asset to hold, that's not true. All currencies devalue or die, and when they do, cash and bonds, which are promises to receive currency, are devalued or wiped out. This is because printing a lot of currency and devaluing debt is the most expedient way of reducing or wiping out debt burdens. Then, the flight back to hard money, stage 6. This was another section of the book I found really interesting and essentially just made me think about Bitcoin and also meme coins. He says, when taken too far, the overprinting of fiat currency leads to the selling of debt assets in the earliest described bank run dynamic, which ultimately reduces the value of money and credit. Blah, 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 blah. History teaches us that people typically turn to gold, silver, and stocks to maintain their real value, and currencies and assets in other countries not having these problems. Some people think that there has to be an alternative reserve currency to go to, i.e. Bitcoin, in my belief. Blah, 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 blah. The same dynamic of the breakdown of the monetary system and the running to other assets has happened in cases in which there was no alternative currency. Example, in dynastic China and during the Roman Empire, there are a lot of things people run to when money is devalued, including rocks. So it was that part where it made me think like, I had an interview with Murad Mabudov, who's one of my friends and classmates, and we talked about the Weimar Republic versus La Belle Epoque, and I had to ask him to clarify exactly what he meant, but he basically was saying, like, on the road to the gold standard or the Bitcoin standard, on the road to La Belle Epoque, we must go through Weimar Republic. We must go through a point in which essentially there'll be all sorts of meme coins in different currencies, and I think we're seeing that right now, right, with the rise of meme coins and the meme coin super cycle. We've made it through what I thought were sort of the most insightful pieces of the book for myself, but again, there was just so many nuggets of wisdom in here, and so I'm going to just kind of highlight a couple of main takeaways that I had, and just some thoughts for the sake of prosperity. On page 212, Dalio talks about wartime economic policies and sort of how governments respond during wartime and what their economic policies tend to look like. And he says, the government will determine A, what items are allowed to be produced, B, what items can be bought and sold and what amounts, C, what items can be imported and exported, D, prices, wages, and profits, E, access to one's own financial assets, and F, the ability to move one's own money out of the country. I thought that was very useful and interesting because you can start to see and track in our own minds how much of these things are starting to be imposed, in terms of price control, rationing, determining of what things are going to be bought and sold. We're already starting to see sort of the early innings of that. And then I also had this thought, cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and privacy coins such as Mimblewimble and Grin and Monero, right? These things are going to be, I think, very powerful for investors in the future because they cannot be controlled by outside authorities such as governments, sort of determining how you use your money, how to spend it, how to export or import your money and send it out of the country or whatever the case may be, and also the traceability of such transactions when it comes to privacy coins. So on page 224, I wrote a big takeaway, and this is kind of just for my safe self to have to maybe go back to one day, but Ray Dalio talks about what he believes are the 3 biggest risks in investing, and sort of all risks boil down to these 3 risks. The 3 biggest risks most investors face are that their portfolios won't provide the returns needed to meet their spending needs, that their portfolios will face ruin, and that a large share of their wealth will be taken away from them, example, through high taxes. or I believe he also says inflation later in the book. So if you're interested in learning more about risk and the largest risk that investors need to study and understand, I highly recommend this book, and page 224 is where that section begins. He provides this really interesting chart where you can see the real return of assets in different countries throughout the decades on page 226. Super, super interesting. He provides it for many different countries: the United States, Great Britain, Japan, Germany, and he breaks it down by decade. And basically what you find out is that, like, for a lot of the time, the real return of financial assets in a country is like not really good, or just like very minimal growth. So I thought that was really interesting. And essentially that's because real returns means you're outpacing inflation, right? And so if they're printing money and the growth of the stock market is contributed to that printing of money, you know, you're essentially no better off than you were before. On page 342, Dalio writes, "Sometimes there is too much debt around the world, and it is in all governments' interest to devalue their currencies. At such times, gold and recently digital currencies, that's where it becomes explicit, can be preferable. Also at such times, governments are more likely to outlaw these alternative currencies, though they can't fully outlaw them." And this is something that I think will happen. I think there will be attempts to outlaw Bitcoin in the United States. But you know, hopefully I'm wrong on that. I do think that I think that's a real risk that will still happen. Someone will try to do that. I don't think it will be successful. I think that it will continue to lead to more division between the states, because I think that desire, if it becomes true, will definitely come from sort of this socialist uprising that we're starting to see in the United States. And the last takeaway from Dalio's book is going to be on page 464. And a lot of the stuff in between is him talking about China and the United States and the relative rise and decline and the relationship between those two countries. I found that all very interesting. So if you're interested in learning about China, the history of China, Chinese politics, international law, or international politics, this book is also interesting for that. But the last takeaway for purposes of this video is going to be Dalio's approach to predicting the future. And he says, to quickly review, my approach is based on my ideas about A, evolution, which causes changes over time, generally towards improvement, such as increasing productivity. B, cycles, which cause rhythmic ups and downs in the economy, like debt bubbles and busts, and bumps along the way. And C, indicators that can help us see where we are in the cycles and what might come next. All right, so that is it for this book review. I hope you guys found this interesting. If you've made it all the way through to this video, thank you. And if you're gonna buy Ray Dalio's book, again, the link in the description to buy that book is provided. It helps me continue to do this thing and grow this channel. But really, I'm excited to continue to document my journey. I went back and watched my book review, which was like 7 minutes long, of Principles by Ray Dalio. And it's funny just to see how far I've come, not only in terms of my ability to talk on camera, but also in terms of my own thinking and experience in the markets. So starting to become a little bit more battle scarred, have obviously learned a lot of things, and have just continued to be a student of the markets. And so if you're interested in watching that growth, participating in, you know, intellectual conversation, part of the reason I do these videos is that I can talk and learn with other people. And so also subscribe to this channel, like this video, you know, share this video, comment below. I love hearing from you guys and talking about your thoughts, if you've read the book or if you're thinking about the book, or if I said something in this video that you disagree with, or that, you know, was maybe something you had never thought about. I'd love to hear from you guys. So thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.